The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and secrets. When Edward Calloway walked through those doors, every nurse froze. Because billionaires don't visit dying children in rural Indiana hospitals. Not alone, not unannounced, and certainly not when that child's name appears on a medical file as their legal responsibility. But there she was, behind glass and steel, 12 years old and fighting for her life, Elena. A girl he hadn't seen in 8 years, a girl he adopted once, then gave away. A girl whose mother died under circumstances no one dared question. And now, a genetic test result that changes everything. A document that proves some secrets have expiration dates, and his just ran out. When his wife arrived 20 minutes later, she didn't cry, didn't embrace him, didn't even look at the dying child. Instead, she whispered a question that turned blood to ice water. "Did you tell anyone that we were the ones who—" She never finished the sentence. But in that silence lay 8 years of buried truth. A suspicious death, and a little girl who survived abandonment twice, first by fate, then by the people who promised to save her. This isn't a story about redemption. It's a story about the moment a man finally looked in the mirror and saw a monster staring back. And the question that will haunt you long after the final words. When does doing the right thing stop being heroism and start being the bare minimum you owed all along? If you want to see how far a man will go to bury his past, and how far a child's fight for survival will drag that past into the light, then stay with us. This story will break you open. And if it moves you, if it makes you feel something real, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to our channel. Because stories like Elena's deserve to be heard, and cowards like Edward deserve to finally face the truth. The disinfectant smell mixed with the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors created a haunting soundtrack in the gray corridors of St. Andrew's Children's Hospital, tucked away in rural Indiana. It was morning, but inside these walls, time seemed suspended in perpetual twilight. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting pale shadows across linoleum floors, worn smooth by decades of desperate footsteps. Nurse Patricia Reynolds had worked the pediatric intensive care unit for 17 years. And she thought she'd seen everything, until the man in the tailored suit walked through the automatic doors that Tuesday morning in late October. Edward Calloway moved through the reception area like a ghost from another dimension. 6'2", impeccably dressed in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than Patricia's monthly salary, with silver cufflinks catching the harsh hospital lighting. His shoes, Italian leather, polished to mirror shine, clicked against the floor with mechanical precision. But it wasn't his expensive appearance that made Patricia's fingers freeze above her keyboard. It was the look in his eyes. Empty. Rehearsed. Like a man preparing to view his own execution. Edward Calloway. The name alone carried weight in Indiana. Real estate mogul. Political donor. The kind of man whose portrait hung in country club lounges and whose handshake could secure a 6-figure investment. Forbes had profiled him twice. The Indianapolis Business Journal called him the quiet titan of the Midwest. He owned half the commercial properties in 3 counties, had his fingers in pharmaceutical distribution, owned stakes in agricultural tech firms most people had never heard of. His net worth hovered somewhere north of $200 million, though the exact figure shifted depending on which financial analyst you asked. And he was here, alone. No security detail, no assistant with a leather portfolio, no carefully managed PR appearance. Just a man in an expensive suit, standing at the nurse's station with a hospital visitor's pass clipped to his lapel, asking to see a patient in room 347. Patricia pulled up the file, her eyes scanning the screen with practiced efficiency. Then she stopped, scrolled back, read it again. Patient, Elena Marie Hartwell. Age, 12 years old. Diagnosis, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, stage 3, guardian, emergency contact, Edward James Calloway, relationship, legal guardian. The air seemed to thicken around Patricia's workstation. She looked up at Edward, then back at the screen. Legal guardian. Not family friend, not benefactor, legal guardian. Of a 12-year-old black girl currently intubated in the pediatric ICU, whose body had been ravaged by 8 months of chemotherapy, whose thin frame bore the brutal marks of a disease that didn't discriminate, but whose treatment options certainly did. Patricia had processed hundreds of admissions, but something about this one felt wrong. Not medically wrong, morally wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your stomach clench and your instincts scream even when you can't articulate why. Room 347 is in the restricted ICU section, Patricia heard herself saying. her voice professionally neutral despite the questions rioting in her mind. "You'll need to sanitize and wear the protective gown. She's immunocompromised. No flowers, no outside food, no—" "I know the protocols," Edward interrupted quietly. His voice was controlled, measured, the kind of voice that had negotiated million-dollar deals without raising an octave. "I've been briefed." But Patricia noticed his hands. They trembled almost imperceptibly as he signed the visitor log. A tiny crack in the facade. She directed him down the hallway, watching as he walked past rooms filled with children in various states of illness and recovery. Past the playroom where a volunteer was reading to 3 kids with IV poles. Past the wall of crayon drawings and construction paper rainbows. Past the reality that most wealthy men like him donated money to avoid confronting directly. Edward stopped at the glass window of room 347, and Patricia, standing 15 feet behind him at her station, watched his shoulders stiffen. Through the glass, barely visible beneath hospital blankets and medical equipment, lay Elena, 12 years old. Her brown skin had taken on an ashen, grayish tone that no child should ever have. The chemo had stolen her hair months ago, not gradually, but in clumps, until her mother had shaved what remained to preserve some dignity. Now her scalp was covered by a soft pink cap, the kind the hospital provided when families couldn't afford alternatives. Her face was bloated from steroids, her lips cracked and pale. An intubation tube snaked from her mouth, taped carefully to prevent displacement. The ventilator hissed rhythmically, whoosh-click, whoosh-click, breathing for her because her body had forgotten how. Multiple IV lines ran into her small arms: nutrition, antibiotics, pain management, immune boosters. The heart monitor traced its unsteady path across the screen. Her vitals were stable, technically, but stable in pediatric oncology was a relative term. It meant alive for now. Edward stood there for 47 seconds. Patricia counted. She couldn't help it. 47 seconds of absolute stillness, staring at a child he claimed legal guardianship over. A child whose name appeared on his official documents, whose medical bills were being paid from an account bearing his name. But he didn't cry. That's what Patricia would remember later, when everything unraveled. He didn't cry. He looked ashamed, caught, like a man staring at evidence of a crime he'd almost convinced himself never happened. The automatic doors whooshed open again 20 minutes later, and Patricia felt the temperature in the corridor drop. Margaret Calloway swept in like winter itself, blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, designer handbag slung over her shoulder, sunglasses pushed up on her head even though it was overcast outside. She wore a cream-colored cashmere coat and boots that probably cost more than Patricia's car payment. Everything about her screamed controlled perfection, except for one detail that Patricia's trained eye caught immediately. Her hands were shaking worse than her husband's. Margaret didn't greet Edward, didn't embrace him, didn't even acknowledge him until she was standing directly beside him at the window, staring at the same unconscious child. The silence between them was suffocating. Patricia pretended to organize charts, but her ears were trained on the couple 10 feet away. "You came," Margaret finally said. Her voice was tight, strangled. "I told you not to come. She's dying, Margaret. She's been dying. For months. Why now? Why here? Why—" Margaret's voice cracked, and she seemed to catch herself, glancing around to see if anyone was listening. Patricia kept her eyes down, but her pen had stopped moving. Dr. Sarah Chen, the resident oncologist, approached with a clipboard, her expression professionally sympathetic but exhausted. She'd been on shift for 14 hours. "Mr. and Mrs. Calloway?" Margaret turned so quickly she nearly stumbled. "Yes, we're here about Elena." Dr. Chen extended her hand. "I'm Dr. Chen. I've been overseeing Elena's care since her admission 6 days ago." She paused, consulting her notes. "I want to be direct with you. Elena's condition has deteriorated significantly. The latest round of chemo hasn't responded as we'd hoped. Her white blood cell count is dangerously low. She developed pneumonia 3 days ago, and her kidney function is compromised. We've got her stabilized, but what are her chances?" Edward's voice cut through the medical terminology. "Dr. Dar." Chen's expression softened with practiced sympathy. "Right now, with aggressive intervention, maybe 30%. But Mr. Calloway, there's something else we need to discuss. Something that came up during her workup." She handed him a manila envelope. "This was attached to her file by mistake. It should have gone to the genetic counseling department first. But since you're here—" Edward opened the envelope with fingers that had negotiated contracts worth millions without trembling, but now shook like leaves. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, genetic testing results, standard protocol for bone marrow transplant matching. And there, in clinical black and white, genetic compatibility analysis, patient Elena Marie Hartwell and Edward James Calloway, 99.997% parental match. The envelope slipped from his fingers, papers scattered across the polished floor. Patricia watched Edward's face drain of color, watched his lips part but no sound emerge, watched a man who built empires with his confidence crumble in a hospital corridor. That's impossible, Edward whispered. That's a mistake. That has to be a mistake. But Dr. Chen's expression told them everything. No mistake, no lab error, just truth, printed on hospital letterhead, irrefutable and damning. Margaret made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, more like air being forcefully expelled from lungs that had just been punched. She grabbed the paper from where it had fallen, her eyes scanning it with growing panic. "No," she breathed. "No, this is wrong. This has to be wrong. Edward, tell her this is wrong." But Edward couldn't speak. He could only stare at the window, at the girl, no, the daughter, dying behind glass and steel and 8 years of carefully constructed lies. Patricia's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, then looked up sharply. The hospital lobby had a visitor, an elderly black woman, thin and determined-looking, clutching an old accordion folder to her chest like it contained state secrets. The security desk was asking if they should send her up. The woman's name, according to the visitor log, Darlene Washington, former social worker, retired, and she was asking specifically for room 347. Patricia's instincts, honed by 17 years of watching families implode under the weight of crisis, started screaming. Whatever was happening in this corridor, whatever secrets were buried in that genetic test, whatever connection bound Edward Calloway to a dying black girl he'd never publicly acknowledged, it was about to crack wide open. Margaret's voice, barely above a whisper, cut through Patricia's thoughts. "Did you tell anyone? Edward? Did you tell anyone that we were the ones who—" She stopped herself, bit her lip hard enough to leave marks. Her eyes darted to Dr. Chen, to Patricia, calculating how much had been overheard. But it was too late. The words hung in the air like smoke, incomplete but unmistakable. "We were the ones who—" "Who what?" Patricia wanted to scream. Who adopted her? Who abandoned her? Who knew something that would explain why a millionaire's biological daughter was dying alone in a hospital, listed under a different last name, while her parents stood in a corridor looking guilty of something far worse than neglect? Edward finally moved. He turned away from the window, away from Elena, away from his wife. He walked 3 steps toward the exit, then stopped. His shoulders began to shake. And Patricia realized with startling clarity, this wasn't a man visiting a sick child. This was a man standing at the scene of a crime he'd spent 8 years trying to forget he'd committed. "Mr. Calloway?" Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but firm. "We need to discuss treatment options. Given the genetic match, you would be an ideal candidate for—" "No." Margaret's voice cut like a blade. "Absolutely not. We need to speak with our attorney first. We need time to process this information and—" "Elena doesn't have time," Dr. Chen said quietly. "She has maybe 48 hours before we need to make critical decisions about her care. If she has a biological parent who's a near-perfect match, that changes everything. It could save her life." In room 347, Elena stirred, just barely. A tiny movement of her fingers against the hospital sheets. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, indifferent to the chaos unfolding outside her glass cage. And Edward Calloway, billionaire real estate mogul, stood frozen in a hospital corridor, staring at his reflection in the polished floor, finally forced to confront the daughter he'd pretended never existed, and the wife who was about to make him pay for the truth. The memory hit Edward like a freight train as he sat in the hospital's cramped family consultation room, Margaret beside him rigid as marble. "Doctor." Chen had excused herself to check on another patient, leaving them alone with the genetic test results spread across the table like accusatory evidence at a trial. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that specific institutional buzz that somehow made everything feel more suffocating, more inescapable. 8 years ago, August 2017. The heat that summer had been unbearable across Indiana, the kind that made asphalt shimmer and tempers flare. Edward could still remember the exact temperature that day, 94 degrees. because the air conditioning in his Lexus had broken on the drive to the Riverside Children's Emergency Shelter. He hadn't wanted to go. That was the first truth he'd buried. Margaret had been the one pushing for public appearances, trying to soften his image before his rumored run for state senate. "People need to see you care about something other than profit margins," she'd said over breakfast that morning, not looking up from her phone where she scrolled through polling data. The optics are perfect. Tragedy, children in need, wealthy couple stepping up. It writes itself. The fire at Riverside had happened 3 days earlier. Electrical malfunction in the basement, they'd said. Started around 2 in the morning when most of the kids were sleeping. 43 children lived in that facility. Group home kids, foster system overflow, emergency placements. By the time the fire department arrived, the building was already half consumed. 17 kids made it out through the front entrance where a night counselor had dragged them. Another 12 escaped through windows, but there were still 14 trapped on the second floor when the main staircase collapsed in flames. That's when Elena, though Edward didn't know her name yet, did something that would become local news legend. 9 years old, small for her age, she'd found a maintenance ladder in a storage closet. She dragged it to a window, propped it against the exterior wall, and helped 6 younger children climb down before the fire department's ladder truck could position itself. When firefighters finally reached her, she was going back inside for a boy who'd frozen in fear. They'd pulled them both out seconds before the roof caved in. The local news ran the story for a week straight. Child hero saves 6 in shelter fire. Her photo was everywhere. Soot-streaked face, oversized donated t-shirt, eyes that looked far older than 9 years had any right to look. The mayor visited her in the hospital. The fire chief gave her a junior badge, and Edward's campaign manager, a sharp-eyed political operative named Rick Sanderson, saw opportunity written in smoke and ash. "This is it," Rick had said, practically vibrating with excitement as he showed Edward the news footage for the 3rd time. "This is your redemption story. You adopt this girl, the hero, the survivor, the one everyone's talking about, and suddenly you're not just another rich guy cutting ribbons. You're compassionate, human, someone who walks the walk." Edward had resisted at first. "We're not adopting a child for a press release, Rick." "Of course not," Rick had smoothly replied. "You're adopting her because it's the right thing to do. The press release is just a bonus." Margaret had been surprisingly enthusiastic, which should have been Edward's first warning sign. His wife didn't do spontaneous compassion. Everything with Margaret was calculated, measured, part of a larger strategy. She'd grown up in Connecticut old money, the kind of family where children were raised by nannies and emotion was considered gauche. Their marriage was a merger more than a romance. Her family connections, his business acumen. It worked because neither of them expected more than what they'd contracted for. Appearance, stability, mutual benefit. "We can give her a good life," Margaret had said that night, practicing her talking points in their bedroom mirror. "Every child deserves a loving home. We're blessed with resources, and it's our duty to share them." The words were perfect, rehearsed, hollow as wind chimes. The adoption moved with shocking speed. Emergency placement due to the shelter fire. Expedited home study because of Edward's standing in the community. Character references from judges and state representatives who owed him favors. By October, Elena Marie Hartwell, birth certificate showing mother deceased, father unknown, officially became Elena Marie Calloway. The press conference was staged in their living room. Margaret wore pearls and a soft pink sweater that tested well with focus groups. Edward stood with his hand on Elena's shoulder, smiling the smile he'd perfected over years of negotiations. Elena wore a new dress, her hair in careful braids, looking like a prop in someone else's performance. Flashbulbs exploded. Questions were lobbed like softballs. "How does it feel to be a mother, Mrs. Calloway? What made you choose Elena specifically? Will this impact your political plans, Mr. Calloway?" The photo that went viral showed Elena hugging Edward, his arms around her shoulders, both of them smiling. The caption, "Love has no color. Indiana businessman and wife open their hearts and home." It was shared 47,000 times in the first week. Edward's favorability ratings jumped 12 points. Rick Sanderson sent champagne, but the camera hadn't captured what happened 30 seconds after that photo was taken. How Elena's smile had faltered when Margaret immediately stepped away to check her phone. How Edward had released her the moment the photographers left, his hands falling to his sides like he'd been holding something toxic. How Elena had stood alone in their perfectly decorated living room, surrounded by furniture worth more than the entire shelter she'd come from, looking small and lost and utterly, devastatingly alone. The first 3 months were bearable because Margaret was playing her role and Edward was mostly absent, buried in work. They'd converted a guest room into Elena's bedroom, professional decorator, everything pink and white and sterile as a hotel. Elena said, "Thank you for everything." Never asked for anything. Ate meals in perfect silence. Did her homework without prompting. It was like living with a ghost who'd been trained to be grateful for haunting their house. The marriage started cracking in month 4. Margaret began drinking more, wine with lunch becoming wine with breakfast. Edward noticed but said nothing. They'd built their relationship on strategic silence. But then came the night he found Margaret in Elena's doorway, watching the girl sleep with an expression that made his blood run cold. Not motherly, not even kind, something else, something that looked almost like hatred. "What's wrong?" he'd asked, pulling her away. Margaret had turned to him with eyes full of wine and venom. "I can't do this. I thought I could, but I can't. She's always here, always watching with those eyes, always reminding me that we're performing charity like it's a job." "You wanted this," Edward had said quietly. "No," Margaret had hissed. "You needed this, for your image, for your precious political career that you haven't even officially announced yet. I went along because that's what I do. I go along with your plans. But living with her, pretending to be her mother, I didn't sign up for that level of commitment." The fights escalated. Not loud ones. The Callaways didn't do loud. Just cold, cutting exchanges in their bedroom after Elena was asleep. Margaret wanted her gone. Edward felt trapped between his political ambitions and a growing, uncomfortable awareness that they'd treated a child like a prop. The guilt was starting to eat at him. But the solution Margaret proposed was worse. Undoing the adoption quietly, finding another placement, using their lawyers and connections to make it all disappear. "We can't just abandon her," Edward had argued. "We're not abandoning her. We're finding her a better fit, a family that actually wants her." But there was the problem. Elena was 9, almost 10. She was Black in a state where most adoptive families weren't. She came from the system with trauma and baggage that showed in the way she flinched at loud noises, the way she hoarded food in her backpack, the way she never quite believed any of this was permanent. Finding another family would be nearly impossible, and admitting failure would destroy Edward's reputation. So they'd found a third option. Rick Sanderson, ever the problem solver, had suggested it over drinks at the country club. Create a trust, set up a private guardian situation. You maintain legal custody on paper, but she lives with a professional caretaker. Boarding school, maybe. You're not abandoning her. You're providing for her in a different way. The press never needs to know the details. Margaret had jumped at it. Edward had not objected strongly enough, which was the same as agreeing, which was the same as failing. They'd found a woman named Patricia Hartwell, no relation, just coincidence, who ran a private group home for older foster kids. Nice place, good reputation, discreet. Edward set up a trust fund that would pay for Elena's care, education, everything she needed. He transferred legal guardianship to a shell custody arrangement that kept his name on documents but removed his daily responsibility. The day they'd taken Elena to her new temporary home, that's how they'd framed it, temporary, she hadn't cried, hadn't argued, just packed her things in the same donated suitcase she'd arrived with and sat in the back seat of Edward's car, staring out the window at houses getting smaller, cheaper, farther from the life she'd briefly touched. "This is better," Margaret had said, speaking to Edward but loud enough for Elena to hear. "You'll have friends your own age, people who understand you better." Edward had caught Elena's eyes in the rearview mirror. She'd looked at him with an expression that would haunt him for 8 years. Not hurt, not even angry, just resigned. Like she'd expected this all along. Like she'd been waiting for the moment when the pretending would end and the real abandonment would begin. He'd driven away from that group home and never went back. Not once. He'd paid every bill, kept her name on his legal documents for reasons he couldn't articulate even to himself, but he never visited, never called. Convinced himself she was better off, that he'd done the right thing, that this was mercy rather than cowardice. Edward, Margaret's voice snapped him back to the present, to the hospital consultation room, to the genetic test proving everything had been even more complicated than he'd let himself remember. "Edward, we need to call Bennett." Bennett was their attorney, the fixer. "And tell him what exactly?" Edward's voice sounded hollow even to himself. Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper even though they were alone. that there's been a mistake, that the hospital mixed up files, that we need to control this narrative before it controls us. The genetic test isn't a mistake. Then we need to figure out how... She stopped herself, glancing at the door. When she spoke again, her words were carefully chosen, coded. We need to remember what we agreed on, back then, about her mother, about why we really adopted her. Edward's blood turned to ice, because suddenly, with terrible clarity, he remembered the other reason, the buried reason, the one he'd locked away so thoroughly he'd almost convinced himself it had never happened. Elena's biological mother, the woman who'd died 6 months before the shelter fire, the woman who'd worked for them, the woman who'd known too much. And Margaret, sitting across from him with panic barely masked behind expensive makeup, was reminding him that some secrets had expiration dates, and theirs had just run out. Dr. Sarah Chen returned to the consultation room carrying a second envelope, this one thicker, more official-looking, with a red confidential stamp across the top. Her expression had shifted from professional sympathy to something harder, more guarded. She'd been a doctor long enough to recognize when families were hiding something, and the Callaways radiated secrets like a nuclear reactor radiated heat. Before we discuss treatment options, Dr. Chen said, settling into the chair across from them, there's another matter that's come to my attention. Hospital protocol requires full medical history for transplant candidates, which means we need complete documentation of Elena's adoption records and any pre-existing genetic information. She slid the envelope across the table. Edward stared at it like it might explode. Margaret's perfectly manicured nails dug into the leather armrest of her chair. Our medical records clerk found this attached to Elena's intake file. It shouldn't have been there. It should have been sealed with the family court records. But sometimes in emergency admissions, things get misplaced. Dr. Chen's pause was deliberate, weighted. I'm required by law to review any documentation that might impact patient care. This qualifies. Edward opened the envelope with hands that had steadied themselves through sheer force of will. Inside were photocopies, old, slightly faded, but perfectly legible. The first page made his throat constrict. It was a genetic compatibility screening, dated November 2016, 9 months before Elena's mother died, 9 months before the adoption. And it showed, in clinical detail, that Edward James Callaway was a 99.97% genetic match to infant Elena Marie Hartwell. But that wasn't the damning part. The damning part was the second document, a confidential paternity test, requested by someone named Teresa Hartwell, Elena's biological mother, a woman who'd worked in the Callaway household as senior housekeeper for 3 years, a woman who'd submitted Edward's DNA, collected from a coffee cup, without his knowledge or consent, a woman who'd been building a case. Margaret's sharp intake of breath told Edward she was reading over his shoulder. Her hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment he thought she might be sick right there in the consultation room. This is privileged information, Margaret managed, her voice strangled. This is sealed by court order. You can't legally... Mrs. Callaway, Dr. Chen interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. I'm not interested in your legal complications. I'm interested in saving a 12-year-old girl's life, and this information directly impacts her medical treatment options. If Mr. Callaway is her biological father, which this document, legal or not, strongly suggests, then he's the ideal bone marrow donor. The genetic compatibility is nearly perfect. Edward couldn't speak. His mind was racing backward, trying to remember. Teresa Hartwell, 32 years old when she died, beautiful in a quiet, understated way. She'd started working for them in 2013, recommended by Margaret's mother's housekeeper. Efficient, invisible, the way good household staff were supposed to be. She'd organized their lives, managed their domestic chaos, knew their schedules better than they did. And one night in March 2016, when Margaret had been in Connecticut visiting her sister, when Edward had worked late and come home exhausted and a little drunk from a business dinner, Teresa had still been there, organizing the study. She'd asked if he needed anything. He'd said bourbon. She'd poured it. They'd talked, really talked, for the first time in 3 years of her working there. About her life, her dreams of becoming a nurse, how she was taking night classes. About his life, his realization that success felt increasingly hollow. About loneliness in big houses. It had been once, just once, a mistake born of alcohol and isolation, and 2 people who shouldn't have crossed that line but did. The next morning, Edward had been consumed with guilt. He'd avoided her for weeks. Eventually, things had returned to awkward normal. She'd never mentioned it. Neither had he. And when she'd quietly resigned 6 months later, citing family reasons, Edward had felt nothing but relief. He'd never known she was pregnant, never knew she'd had the baby, never knew she'd been working up the courage to tell him, backed by genetic proof. "This can't be real," Edward whispered, though he knew it was. Every detail aligned too perfectly. Dr. Chen pulled out another document. "There's more. A draft petition for paternity establishment, never filed. It was dated April 2017, 2 months before Teresa Hartwell died in a car accident. She was planning to pursue legal recognition and child support." Margaret's face had gone from pale to gray. "Where did you get these documents?" "A woman named Darlene Washington brought them this morning. She's downstairs in the waiting room. Says she was Teresa's caseworker and friend. Says she's been holding on to these for years, waiting for the right moment to bring them forward." Dr. Chen's gaze was steady, unflinching. "She seems to think that moment is now, given that Elena is dying and her biological father is finally here." The room tilted. Edward gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Darlene Washington. He remembered that name. She'd been at Teresa's funeral. Small service, barely attended. She'd stared at Edward across the cemetery with eyes that knew too much. He'd left before the burial, telling himself he was being paranoid. "I need to speak with her," Edward said suddenly. "Absolutely not," Margaret snapped. "Edward, do not say another word. We need Bennett here before anyone speaks to anyone." But Edward was already standing. Something had cracked inside him. Maybe it was seeing Elena dying in that hospital bed. Maybe it was the weight of 8 years of lies. Maybe it was just exhaustion from carrying secrets that had grown heavier than empires. No more lawyers, no more cover-ups. "I need to know what really happened to Teresa." "You know what happened," Margaret said, her voice low and venomous. "She died in a car accident. Single-vehicle collision on Route 37, lost control on a curve. These things happen." 2 weeks after she tried to schedule a meeting with me, Edward said slowly, pieces clicking together in his mind like a puzzle he'd been avoiding for years. 2 weeks after my assistant told me someone named Teresa kept calling, saying it was urgent. 2 weeks after you convinced me not to take her calls because she was probably trying to extort money. Margaret's expression shifted. Just for a second. Just enough. A flash of something that looked like panic before the mask slammed back into place. "That's not fair. You're rewriting history because you feel guilty." "Am I?" Edward's voice was rising, 8 years of suppressed questions finally breaking through. "Because I'm starting to remember things differently. I'm remembering you were very insistent that I fire her. Very insistent that we have her sign additional NDAs. Very concerned about what she might know about our financial arrangements. She worked in our home. She had access to confidential documents. That's standard practice. She was building a case for paternity," Edward interrupted. "She had genetic proof. She had legal grounds. And then, conveniently, she died before she could file anything." The silence that followed was explosive. Dr. Chen's eyes widened slightly, her gaze darting between husband and wife. She was a doctor, not a detective, but she'd just heard something that sounded dangerously like an accusation. "I think," Dr. Chen said carefully, standing up, "I need to step out and give you two some privacy. But Mr. Calloway, Mrs. Calloway, Elena needs a decision about the transplant within 48 hours. Whatever happened in the past, that child is dying now. And if you're her father," she looked directly at Edward, "then you have the ability to save her life. I'll leave you to discuss it." She left, closing the door with a quiet click that sounded like a gavel falling. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot below. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet Edward almost couldn't hear it. "You don't understand what you're suggesting. Then help me understand." She turned, and Edward saw something in her face he'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Not of scandal, not of consequences, but of truth. "If you start asking questions about Teresa's death, if you bring attention to her accident, if you connect it to Elena..." She stopped, swallowed hard. "There are people who helped us back then, people who made problems go away, people who don't want those problems resurfacing." Edward felt cold seep through his body. "What did you do, Margaret?" "What we had to do," she said, and her voice had taken on a desperate edge. "You were about to announce your Senate run. Teresa was going to file paternity. The press would have destroyed us. Your career would have been over before it started. So yes, I made phone calls. I asked for help from people who know how to handle delicate situations. You had her killed. It wasn't a question. I had the problem resolved," Margaret said sharply. There's a difference. The accident was real. The investigation was real. But maybe it happened more conveniently than it would have naturally. And maybe certain evidence was overlooked. And maybe the case closed faster than it should have. But Edward, she moved toward him, desperate now. We agreed, you and I. When I told you the problem was handled, you didn't ask questions. You accepted it. You benefited from it. She was right. That was the terrible truth. He'd been relieved when Teresa stopped calling. Relieved when the awkward situation resolved itself. He hadn't wanted to know how or why. He'd let Margaret handle it, the way he let her handle all the uncomfortable necessities of their life together. And then, 4 months later, when the shelter fire happened and Rick Sanderson suggested adopting Elena, not knowing who she really was, just seeing good optics, Edward had recognized the name. Hartwell, Teresa's daughter. He'd seen the opportunity to assuage guilt without admitting truth. He'd thought maybe, in some twisted way, giving her a good life was penance for what he'd allowed to happen to her mother. But adoption required too much proximity, too much risk of discovery. So he'd abandoned her too. I'm donating the marrow, Edward said quietly. If you do that, Margaret said, her voice ice, everything comes out. Darlene Washington will make sure of it. The press will investigate. They'll look into Teresa's death. They'll find connections. And Edward, we could both go to prison. Then we go to prison, Edward said. But that girl upstairs doesn't die because I'm a coward twice over. A knock at the door interrupted them. Patricia Reynolds, the nurse, poked her head in apologetically. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Washington is insisting on speaking with you. She says she has more documentation that Mr. Calloway needs to see. And Mr. Calloway? Patricia hesitated. Elena is awake, just for a few minutes. She's asking if anyone's here for her. Edward looked at Margaret, then at the envelope still sitting on the table, containing proof of every lie they'd told. Then at the door, beyond which a woman waited with more truths, and a daughter lay dying from secrets kept too long. Send Mrs. Washington in, Edward said, and tell Elena. His voice cracked. Tell Elena her father is here. Darlene Washington entered the consultation room like a woman who'd been preparing for this moment for 8 years. She was 73 years old, thin as a rail, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that had witnessed too much suffering to be intimidated by wealth or power. She wore a simple navy cardigan over a floral dress, sensible shoes, and carried that accordion folder like it contained the deeds to hell itself. When she looked at Edward, her gaze was neither hostile nor sympathetic, just tired, bone deep, soul tired. Mr. Calloway, she said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone her age. I wondered if this day would ever come. Part of me hoped it wouldn't have to. Margaret had positioned herself near the door, arms crossed, looking like she was calculating escape routes. Edward remained seated, his hands flat on the table, trying to project a calm he absolutely did not feel. Mrs. Washington, he managed. I understand you have information about how you and your wife destroyed my best friend's life, Darlene interrupted, her politeness evaporating. About how Teresa Hartwell died under suspicious circumstances 2 weeks after telling me she was finally going to demand you acknowledge your daughter? Yes, Mr. Calloway, I have information, volumes of it. She dropped the accordion folder on the table with a thud that made Margaret flinch. Dust motes scattered in the fluorescent light. Darlene pulled out a chair and sat without being invited, her movements deliberate, controlled. I was Teresa's social worker when she aged out of foster care at 18, Darlene began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd told this story to herself 1,000 times, waiting for the chance to tell it out loud. Smart girl, determined. She'd had a rough childhood. Mother died of an overdose when she was 6, bounced through 7 different foster homes, but she never let it break her. She wanted to be a nurse, wanted to help people the way she wished someone had helped her mother. Edward felt something twist in his chest. He'd never known any of this. Teresa had been a fixture in his home for 3 years, and he'd never bothered to learn her story. She took the housekeeping job with your family because it paid well and had flexible hours so she could take night classes, Darlene continued. She was proud of that job. Said you and Mrs. Calloway were demanding but fair. She thought she'd work for you for a few years, save money, get her nursing degree, move on with her life. Darlene's jaw tightened. And then you happened, Mr. Calloway. The words hit like a slap. Margaret made a small sound of protest, but Darlene's gaze silenced her with surgical precision. Teresa called me the morning after, March 23, 2016. I remember because it was her birthday. She'd turned 29. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She felt ashamed, guilty, like she'd done something wrong by being vulnerable for one night with a man who should have known better. A married man, her employer. "It was a mistake," Edward said quietly, the words ash in his mouth. "I never meant to." "No one ever means to," Darlene cut him off. "But consequences don't care about intentions." 3 weeks later, she found out she was pregnant. She came to my house and we sat in my kitchen for 4 hours trying to figure out what to do. She didn't want to trap you, didn't want your money. She just wanted to know if you'd be willing to be a father to this child, or if she needed to plan for doing it alone. Darlene pulled out a worn envelope, the paper soft from being handled countless times. "She wrote you 12 letters over the course of her pregnancy. 12. She was too scared to send them. Too afraid you'd fire her, sue her, destroy her life. So she kept working in your house, watching her belly grow, trying to stay invisible while carrying your child." Edward's eyes burned. He couldn't look at Margaret, couldn't bear to see whatever expression was on her face. "After Elena was born," Darlene continued, her voice softening slightly, "Teresa tried to keep working. She needed the income, and your wife had agreed to let her bring the baby to work sometimes, keep her in the staff quarters. But that only lasted 6 months. Mrs. Calloway," Darlene's gaze shifted, hardened. "You started making comments about the baby crying, about Teresa being distracted, about inappropriate boundaries. You suggested she might be happier in a different position elsewhere." Margaret's face was stone. "That's not how I remember it." "I'm sure it's not," Darlene said coldly. "Memory is convenient that way. But I have Teresa's journals. I have voice memos she recorded when she was too exhausted to write. I have documentation of every cruelty, every dismissal, every time you made her feel like she and her baby were inconveniences in your pristine world." She pulled out a leather journal, pages flagged with sticky notes. March 2017. Mrs. C saw E looking at a photo of Elena today. She called me into her office and said I needed to maintain professional distance. Said having personal items in the workspace was inappropriate. She knows. I think she knows, and she's trying to push me out before I can say anything. The room felt airless. Edward remembered that time. Margaret had been especially tense, especially controlling. He'd attributed it to stress about his potential political campaign. Now he wondered what she'd suspected, what she'd known. "When Teresa decided she couldn't stay silent anymore," Darlene said, "when Elena was almost 2 and she was barely making ends meet, she came to me with a plan. She'd saved enough for a paternity test. She'd documented everything. She wasn't asking for millions. She was asking for child support and acknowledgement. She wanted Elena to know her father. She thought maybe, if you knew you had a daughter, you might want to be part of her life." Darlene pulled out the genetic test results. The original, not the photocopy Dr. Chen had. Then another document that made Edward's blood run cold. "But before she filed the paternity suit," Darlene said, sliding the paper across the table, "she discovered something else. This. It was a will. Edward's will. Dated December 2016, 3 months after Elena's birth, 1 month after Teresa had finally worked up the courage to tell Edward about his daughter during a brief, awkward conversation in his study that he'd cut short, claiming he had a conference call. The document was in Edward's handwriting, witnessed and notarized. In it, he acknowledged Elena Marie Hartwell as his biological daughter and bequeathed 40% of his estate to her upon his death. 40%. Not a token amount, a legitimate inheritance. "You knew," Edward whispered, staring at his own signature. "I knew." The memory came flooding back with brutal clarity. That conversation with Teresa, her quiet voice saying, "There's something I need to tell you about Elena." His instant understanding. Some part of him had always known, had done the math, had seen himself in the baby's eyes during those few awkward encounters in the house. He'd cut her off before she could finish, told her they'd discuss it later, alone. And he had. One night when Margaret was asleep, he'd drafted that will. Some attempt at taking responsibility without actually taking responsibility. Money and death to substitute for presence in life. He'd filed it with his attorney, felt marginally better about himself, and then, forgotten, or forced himself to forget. 2 months later, Darlene's voice brought him back. This will was revoked and replaced with a new one. No mention of Elena, no acknowledgement of paternity, nothing, like she never existed. Edward's hands were shaking. "I don't remember changing it." "You didn't," Darlene said. "Your wife did. with your power of attorney that you'd granted her for estate management. She found the original will, had your lawyer draft a new one, and you signed it without reading it carefully. I know because Teresa's attorney found the replacement document during discovery research. Mrs. Calloway made sure your daughter was written out of your life before she was ever officially written in. Margaret's face was white. That's slander. You can't prove— I have the attorney's notes, Darlene interrupted calmly. I have the dates. I have Margaret Calloway's signature on the request forms. And I have Teresa's final journal entry, written the day before she died. She opened the journal to the last page, her hand trembling slightly as she read. Darlene thinks I'm being paranoid, but I don't think the brake failure in the parking lot last week was an accident. Mrs. C knows I'm planning to file. She's made comments about how dangerous it would be to create problems for the family. I'm scared, but I'm more scared of Elena growing up thinking her father didn't want her. Tomorrow I'm filing the papers. Tomorrow I tell the truth. If anything happens to me, Darlene has everything. She'll make sure Elena knows someone fought for her. The silence in the room was suffocating. Edward looked at Margaret, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. Or maybe he was seeing her clearly for the first time. The next day, Darlene said, her voice breaking slightly, Teresa's car went off Route 37. Single vehicle accident. The police report said her brakes failed. The investigation concluded it was mechanical failure. No foul play. The case closed in 4 days. 4 days, Edward echoed numbly. My friend died suspicious of murder, and the investigation lasted 4 days, Darlene said. So yes, Mr. Calloway, I've been holding on to these documents. Waiting, watching. When you adopted Elena after the shelter fire, I thought maybe you'd actually step up. Maybe guilt would succeed where responsibility failed. But then you gave her away too. Shuffled her off to a group home like she was another problem to be managed. She stood, leaving all the documents on the table. That little girl upstairs is dying. She's dying without ever knowing why her mother disappeared, why her father abandoned her twice, why she wasn't worth fighting for. You have 48 hours to decide if you're going to save her life. I suggest you also decide if you're going to finally tell her the truth. Darlene walked toward the door, then paused. And Mrs. Calloway? I've already given copies of everything to a journalist friend. If anything happens to me or to Elena, or if Mr. Calloway mysteriously refuses to donate the marrow he's perfectly matched to provide, all of this goes public. Every document, every journal entry, every suspicious detail about Teresa's death. You can threaten me with lawsuits, but I'm 73 and dying of emphysema. I have nothing left to lose and everything left to set right. She left, the door closing behind her with quiet finality. Edward and Margaret sat in the wreckage of their carefully constructed lies, surrounded by evidence of exactly who they'd been and what they'd done. In the silence, Edward heard the distant sound of monitors beeping, keeping a little girl alive. A little girl who shared his DNA and his cowardice and his capacity to survive, despite everything working against her. What are we going to do? Margaret whispered. Edward looked at the will, at his own handwriting acknowledging a daughter he'd tried so hard to deny. I'm going to donate the marrow, he said, and then I'm going to tell Elena everything. The Indiana State Police archive room smelled like old paper and bureaucratic neglect. Edward sat in a plastic chair at a scratched metal table, waiting for the clerk to bring him the accident report he'd requested. Margaret had left the hospital in fury 2 hours earlier, threatening divorce, threatening lawyers, threatening to handle this the way she'd handled things before. Edward had let her go. Some part of him, the part that had been slowly dying for 8 years, hoped he'd never see her again. The clerk, a bored-looking woman in her 50s, dropped a thin manila folder on the table. Vehicle accident report, May 2017, Route 37. That's all we got. Edward opened it with trembling hands. The report was exactly as Darlene had described. Cursory, efficient, closed. Victim, Teresa Marie Hartwell, age 32. Single vehicle collision, 11:47 p.m., May 14, 2017. Vehicle left roadway on a curve, struck embankment. Driver killed on impact. Cause, brake failure due to corroded brake line. Contributing factors, wet road conditions, speed possibly excessive for weather. No witnesses. No other vehicles involved. Case closed May 18, 2017. 4 days. An entire life summarized and dismissed in 4 days. But Edward had spent 30 years reading contracts, analyzing documents, spotting what wasn't said as much as what was. And this report screamed omissions. No toxicology screen mentioned. No mechanical inspection details beyond corroded brake line, which could mean anything or nothing. No follow-up with Teresa's employer, him, her family, none listed, her associates. The investigating officer's notes were sparse to the point of negligence. Appears accidental. No evidence of foul play. Edward pulled out his phone and took photos of every page. Then he noticed something at the bottom of the report. A handwritten notation, almost illegible. Per request, Chief Morrison. Expedite closure. Family declined autopsy. Family declined autopsy. But Teresa had no family. Elena had been 2 years old, in no position to decline anything. So who had claimed to be family? Who had pushed for the case to close quickly? Edward's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Stop digging. You won't like what you find. M. Margaret. Warning him off, which meant there was more to find. He drove to the address listed in the report as Teresa's last known residence, a small apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Indianapolis. The building was tired but maintained, with kids' bikes chained to the railings and window boxes holding the last flowers of autumn. Unit 2B had been Teresa's. A woman in her 60s answered his knock, regarding him with immediate suspicion. If you're selling something, I'm not interested. I'm looking for information about a woman who lived here 8 years ago, Edward said. Teresa Hartwell. She died in... I know when she died, the woman interrupted, her expression softening slightly. I'm Linda Chen. I was her neighbor. Lived in 2C. Still do. She studied Edward more carefully. You're the father, aren't you? Of her little girl. Edward felt the words like a physical blow. How did you... She told me. Not everything, but enough. Said the father was a married man, someone powerful, someone who could make things difficult if she pushed too hard. But she showed me pictures of the baby. That little girl had your eyes. Linda stepped back, opening the door wider. You better come in. Linda's apartment was small but immaculate, filled with family photos and the smell of coffee. She poured 2 cups without asking and sat across from Edward at her tiny kitchen table. Teresa was a good person, Linda began. Quiet, kept to herself mostly, but good. She worked all the time. Days at your house, nights taking classes, weekends doing extra shifts wherever she could. She was determined to build a better life for Elena. That baby was everything to her. I didn't know, Edward said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. Maybe you didn't want to know, Linda replied not unkindly. Teresa said you weren't cruel, just absent. Like you'd decided if you didn't acknowledge the situation, it wouldn't exist. But she also said your wife knew, and your wife was cruel. Edward's chest tightened. What do you mean? Linda stood and retrieved a shoebox from her closet. Teresa gave me this about 3 weeks before she died. Said if anything happened to her, I should make sure someone saw it. I gave most of it to that social worker friend of hers, Darlene. But I kept some things. Wasn't sure who to trust with them. She opened the box. Inside were photographs, notes, and a small audio recorder, the old-fashioned kind with mini cassette tapes. Teresa was scared those last few weeks, Linda said. Real scared. Her car had been vandalized twice. Nothing obvious, just little things. Sugar in the gas tank one time, though she couldn't prove it. The brake line problem that killed her? That wasn't the first time her brakes had mysteriously failed. 2 weeks before the accident, she had to get them fixed after they went soft. The mechanic said it looked like someone had punctured the line, but not completely, just enough to cause slow leakage. Teresa reported it to the police, but they said without proof of intentional damage, it was probably just wear and tear. Edward's hands shook as he reached for the audio recorder. What's on this? A conversation Teresa recorded from outside your home office, 4 days before she died. She'd gone to pick up her last paycheck after your wife fired her. She heard voices and turned on her phone recorder. She'd started documenting everything by then, afraid of being blamed for something or having things twisted. Linda pressed play. The audio was muffled but audible. Margaret's voice sharp and cold. Don't care what you think you're owed. You were an employee who made a stupid mistake with my husband. That doesn't entitle you to anything. Teresa's voice, quieter, strained. I'm not asking for anything except acknowledgement. Elena deserves to know her father. And legally, Edward has financial responsibilities. Legally? Margaret's laugh was cutting. Let me explain how legal works in this world, Teresa. My family has more lawyers than you have relatives. We can bury you in paperwork, drag out any case for years, make sure you spend every penny you have just fighting for the right to be heard. Is that what you want for your daughter? Years of legal battles, her name dragged through tabloids, everyone knowing she's the bastard child of a maid who seduced her employer. I didn't seduce anyone. That's not how the story will be told, Margaret interrupted. I'll make sure of it. You'll be painted as a gold digger, a manipulator, someone who deliberately got pregnant to trap a wealthy man. Your reputation will be destroyed. Your nursing aspirations? Over. No hospital will hire someone involved in that kind of scandal. You'll lose everything. And for what? So Edward can write a check once a month and never actually be a father? A long pause. Then Teresa, her voice trembling. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you about consequences, Margaret replied smoothly. But since you seem determined to pursue this foolish path, let me be very clear. If you file those paternity papers, if you try to make any of this public, you will regret it. Accidents happen, Teresa. Jobs are lost. Housing becomes unavailable. Social services receive anonymous tips about unfit mothers. Do you understand what I'm saying? You can't. I can do whatever is necessary to protect my family, Margaret said, her voice dropping to something deadly calm. And I will. So I suggest you take your baby, take the severance check I'm offering, which is far more generous than you deserve, and disappear from our lives. Because if you don't, I promise you'll wish you had. The recording ended with the sound of a door slamming. Edward sat frozen, the coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd heard his wife negotiate business deals, handle difficult people, deploy strategic ruthlessness when necessary. But this was something else entirely. This was a threat. Clear, unmistakable, terrifying. 4 days after that conversation, Linda said quietly, Teresa's brakes failed on Route 37. She died instantly. The police report said no foul play, Edward whispered, but even as he said it, he knew how hollow it sounded. The police report said whatever someone wanted it to say, Linda replied. Teresa told me your wife had connections. Family money, political influence, people who owed favors. She said Margaret had mentioned knowing the police chief, having dinner with the county prosecutor. Teresa was scared, but she was also brave. She filed those paternity papers the day before she died. I saw her do it. She said, if something happens to me, at least there'll be a record that I tried. Edward's mind was reeling. Why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you tell someone? I tried, Linda said, and for the first time her composure cracked. I called the detective handling the case. He told me grief makes people see conspiracies where there are none. I contacted a lawyer, pro bono because I couldn't afford a real one, and he said without hard evidence, accusations against someone like Margaret Calloway were career suicide. I gave everything to Darlene and hoped she'd know what to do with it. And then, her voice hardened, you adopted Elena. I thought maybe that was justice in a twisted way. That you'd actually take care of Teresa's daughter, but then you gave her away too. The shame was suffocating. Edward stood, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know Margaret had threatened her. I didn't know about the recording. I thought... He stopped, forced himself to say it. I thought Teresa's death was convenient. I thought it, and I didn't question it, and that makes me complicit. Linda watched him with hard eyes. What are you going to do about it now? Edward pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he needed. Daniel Pierce, an investigative journalist with the Indianapolis Star who'd been trying to interview Edward for years about various business deals. A man with a reputation for not backing down from powerful people. I'm going to tell the truth, Edward said. All of it. Margaret's threats, the suspicious accident, the adoption and abandonment. Everything. He looked at Linda. Can I take this recording and these photos? Linda hesitated, then nodded. Teresa wanted Elena to know her mother fought for her. Make sure she knows. Edward was halfway to his car when his phone rang. Dr. Chen. Mr. Calloway, you need to come back to the hospital. Elena woke up again. She's asking questions about her mother. And Dr. Chen's voice wavered. She said something strange. She said, he knows what happened to my mama. He promised he'd never tell. Mr. Calloway, what does she mean? What did you promise? Edward's blood turned to ice. Because suddenly he remembered. 3 years ago, visiting the group home on Elena's 9th birthday, his one and only visit after abandoning her there. She'd asked about her mother. He'd told her Teresa died in an accident. And Elena, with those 2 wise eyes, had said, was it really an accident? And Edward, coward that he was, had knelt down and whispered, some questions are safer left unasked. Can you do that for me? Can you not ask? and she'd nodded, made a promise to protect him by staying silent about her own mother's death. "I'm on my way," Edward said, ending the call. He had 48 hours to decide about the transplant. But more than that, he had one chance, maybe his only chance, to finally be the father Teresa had believed he could be. The father who chose truth over comfort, his daughter over his reputation, justice over cowardice, even if it cost him everything. Edward arrived at the hospital to find a circus erupting outside. News vans lined the circular drive, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metal flowers seeking sun. Reporters clutched microphones, and cameramen jockeyed for position near the main entrance. Someone had leaked the story. Edward Callaway, millionaire real estate mogul, at Children's Hospital, with secret daughter dying of leukemia. The feeding frenzy had begun. Margaret stood near the hospital's administrative offices, perfectly composed in a navy suit, her PR consultant beside her gesturing emphatically. She was preparing for damage control, Edward realized, preparing to spin this into something palatable, something that wouldn't destroy the empire they'd built on lies. She saw him and her expression flickered, just for a moment, between rage and desperation. Then the mask slammed back into place. She approached with her consultant trailing behind, a thin man named Gerard, who looked like he'd been born in a boardroom. "We're holding a press conference in 90 minutes, Margaret announced without preamble. "Gerard has prepared a statement. You adopted Elena years ago as an act of charity after the shelter fire. Her biological mother was a former employee who died tragically. You've been providing for Elena's care privately, and you're here now because you were notified of her medical crisis. It's a story of compassion, not scandal. The genetic test results will be explained as a coincidental close match. Rare, but medically documented. We control the narrative before it controls us." Edward stared at his wife like she was speaking a foreign language. "You want to hold a press conference, while our daughter is dying upstairs. She's not our daughter," Margaret hissed, her composure cracking. "She's a complication we're managing. And if we don't manage this correctly, everything we've built will collapse. Your reputation, my family name, our financial arrangements, all of it, Edward. Gone." Gerard cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Callaway, with all due respect, Mrs. Callaway is right. The optics here are salvageable, but only if we move quickly. Delay gives reporters time to dig, to find inconsistencies. We need to get ahead of this with a clean, sympathetic narrative." "A clean narrative," Edward repeated slowly. "Built on what? More lies?" "Built on strategic truth," Gerard corrected. "We acknowledge what we have to, minimize what we can, and redirect attention to your charitable intentions. You become the hero of this story, not the villain. The businessman with a heart who stepped up when a child needed him." Edward thought of Teresa's voice on that recording, trembling but brave. Thought of Elena asking if her mother's death was really an accident. Thought of Darlene Washington's tired eyes, carrying 8 years of truth no one wanted to hear. Thought of himself, standing in this hospital, being offered one more chance to choose comfort over courage. "No," he said quietly. Margaret's eyes widened. "What did you say?" "I said no. No press conference, no strategic narrative, no more lies." Edward pulled out his phone, scrolling to the recording Linda had given him. "I have Teresa's recording, Margaret. I have her documenting your threats. I have witnesses who can testify to the suspicious circumstances of her death, and I have a journalist who's very interested in hearing all of it." The color drained from Margaret's face. Gerard took a step back, suddenly looking like a man who'd just realized he was standing too close to an explosion. "You're bluffing," Margaret whispered. "You wouldn't. You'd destroy yourself too." "I know," Edward said, "and I don't care anymore. I'm going upstairs to tell Elena the truth about who I am and what I allowed to happen to her mother. Then I'm donating the marrow. And then I'm cooperating fully with whatever investigation needs to happen into Teresa's death. If that means I go to prison for obstruction or conspiracy or being an accessory after the fact, so be it. But I'm done being the man who chose silence over his daughter's life." He turned to walk away, but Margaret grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Edward, please, think about what you're doing. We can fix this. We can make this right without destroying everything. We can't make this right," Edward interrupted, gently removing her hand. "That's the point you've never understood, Margaret. Some things can't be fixed or spun or managed. Some things you just have to face and accept the consequences of. I've been running from those consequences for 8 years. I'm done running." He left her standing there, Gerard already pulling out his phone to presumably call lawyers. Edward took the elevator to the 4th floor, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Nurse Patricia was at her station and gave him a look that was equal parts sympathy and something harder. Judgment, maybe, or just exhaustion with rich people's problems playing out in her ICU. "She's awake," Patricia said. "Dr. Chen is with her. Fair warning, Mr. Calloway. Elena's been asking hard questions. Questions we don't have answers to." Edward nodded, unable to speak. He walked down the corridor to room 347, each step feeling like walking toward his own reckoning. Through the glass, he could see Elena propped up slightly in bed, the intubation tube removed now, though an oxygen cannula still fed into her nose. She looked impossibly small against the hospital pillows, her bald head covered by that pink cap, her brown skin still carrying that grayish pallor of someone whose body was fighting a war it was losing. Dr. Chen emerged from the room, her expression carefully neutral. "She knows you're here. She knows you're her biological father. I had to explain the genetic test results in case we need to move forward with transplant procedures. She's processing a lot right now, Mr. Calloway. Be gentle." "Can I go in?" "That's up to her." Dr. Chen knocked softly on the glass. Elena's eyes turned toward them, and even from here, Edward could see they were Teresa's eyes, not his, her mother's, dark and deep and carrying too much knowledge for 12 years. Dr. Chen asked something Edward couldn't hear. Elena's gaze fixed on Edward, and for a long moment she just stared. Then, barely perceptible, she nodded. Edward entered the room on shaking legs. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. The oxygen hissed softly. Elena watched him approach, her expression unreadable. "Hi," Edward said, and immediately felt like an idiot. "Hi." As if this were a casual meeting, as if they were strangers at a coffee shop instead of father and daughter meeting over the wreckage of every lie that had separated them. "You're really him," Elena said, her voice hoarse from the intubation. "My biological father, not just the man who adopted me and gave me away. Actually my father." "Yes," Edward said, the word barely audible. "I am. And Elena, Did you know?" She interrupted. "When you adopted me after the fire, did you know I was your daughter?" This was the moment where he could still lie, could say he'd only just discovered it, could preserve some scrap of dignity. But Edward had walked into this room to finally choose truth, and truth was all he had left to offer. "Yes," he said. "I knew. I recognized your mother's last name. I'd been told she'd died, and I saw you were her daughter and something in your face. I saw it. I saw myself, and I adopted you because I felt guilty about your mother, and because I thought maybe I could give you a good life to make up for everything I hadn't done. But then I was a coward. I let my wife push you away, and I convinced myself it was better for you, but really it was just easier for me." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed steady. "The nurse said my mother died in a car accident. Was it really an accident?" And here was the second moment of truth, the one that would break what little was left of this child's world. Edward could see Teresa's face in his mind, her quiet determination, her love for this daughter. He could hear her voice on that recording, frightened but refusing to back down. Edward pulled a chair close to Elena's bed and sat down. "Your mother was the bravest person I've ever known," he began, his voice breaking. "And no, sweetheart, I don't think it was an accident. I think my wife had her killed because your mother was going to fight for you, was going to make sure you knew your father. And instead of protecting her, instead of standing up to Margaret, I looked away. I let it happen because it was convenient. Because I was a coward who cared more about his reputation than about the truth or about you or about your mother's life." The tears were streaming down Elena's face now, silent and devastating. "You let someone kill my mama?" "I didn't know for certain at the time," Edward said, and the excuse felt pathetic even as he said it. "But I suspected. I wondered. And I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to know the answers. So yes, Elena, in every way that matters, I let it happen. And then I took you in not to save you, but to ease my own guilt. And when that got hard, I abandoned you too. And I am so, so sorry." Elena turned her face away, staring at the wall. The monitors beeped, the oxygen hissed. Edward sat in the wreckage of his confession, offering nothing but truth because it was all he had left. "The doctor says you can save me," Elena finally said, not looking at him. "Says you're a perfect match for the transplant, that if you donate marrow, I might live." "I'm going to," Edward said immediately. "Whatever you need, Elena. I'm going to do it." "Why?" She turned back to face him, and her eyes were hard now, aged beyond her years. Why would you save me now when you didn't save my mama? When you didn't fight for me before? Is it guilt? Or is it just that now people are watching and you need to look like a hero? The question cut deeper than any accusation. I don't know, Edward admitted. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's that I finally understand I've spent 8 years being exactly the kind of man I always swore I'd never become. Maybe it's just that when I saw you lying here dying, I realized some debts can never be paid, but you pay them anyway because not paying them makes you something less than human. Elena studied him for a long moment. Will she go to prison? Your wife? For what she did to my mama? I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she does, Edward said. I'm going to tell the police everything I know. Give them the recording your mother made. Cooperate with whatever investigation happens, even if it means I go to prison too for what I didn't do, for staying silent, for being part of it. Good, Elena said softly. Then, even softer, I don't forgive you. I know, Edward said, and something in his chest shattered completely. I don't forgive me either. But, Elena hesitated, her hand moving slightly on the bed. If you save my life, maybe someday I won't hate you. I don't know if I can ever love you like a daughter should love a father. You took that chance away from both of us. But maybe someday I won't hate you. It was more than he deserved. More grace than he'd earned. Edward reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched his daughter's hand for the first time in 8 years. Her fingers were thin, fragile, fighting. I'm going to tell the world the truth, he said. All of it. About your mother. About Margaret. About what I did and didn't do. It's going to be ugly in public and it's going to hurt. But you deserve for people to know your mother was a hero who died fighting for you. You deserve for people to know the truth. Elena nodded slowly, exhaustion pulling at her features. Okay. And then, Edward continued, if you survive this, when you survive this, you never have to see me again if you don't want to. I'll set up whatever you need, make sure you're taken care of, but on your terms, not mine. Never mine again. Okay, Elena whispered again, her eyes already closing. Edward sat with her until she fell asleep, holding her hand, feeling her pulse flutter against his palm. This small heartbeat, this fragile life, the only thing that remained of Teresa's courage and his own cowardice. Outside, the media circus continued. Margaret was probably finalizing her defense strategy. Lawyers were undoubtedly being mobilized. But in this quiet room, with machines breathing for his daughter, and truth finally spoken after 8 years of silence, Edward Calloway began the long, painful process of becoming someone his daughter might someday not hate. It was, he thought, the best he could hope for. The bone marrow extraction procedure was scheduled for 6 a.m. the following morning. Edward spent the night in a hospital chair outside Elena's room, refusing the private suite Margaret's assistant had tried to book for him. He'd sent a single text to his secretary, cancel everything, indefinitely. Then he'd turned off his phone and sat in the fluorescent-lit silence, watching nurses move through their rounds, listening to the symphony of machines keeping fragile lives tethered to Earth. At 4 a.m., Daniel Pierce arrived. The investigative journalist was younger than Edward expected, maybe 40, with tired eyes and ink stains on his fingers from still preferring notebooks to tablets. He carried a leather messenger bag worn soft with use and sat down in the chair beside Edward without introduction. I got your message, Daniel said quietly, aware of the sleeping patients nearby. And the files you sent. I've been up all night going through them. The recording alone is, Jesus, Mr. Calloway, this is going to detonate. Good, Edward said. When can you run it? I need to verify sources, get statements, do this right so it holds up legally. Maybe a week. But Edward. Can I call you Edward? At Edward's nod, Daniel continued. You understand what this means for you. Even if you weren't directly involved in Teresa Hartwell's death, obstruction charges alone could put you away for years. And your wife? If even half of what that recording suggests is true, she's looking at conspiracy to commit murder. Your entire life is about to implode. I know, Edward said simply. Write it anyway. All of it. Don't protect me. Daniel studied him with the assessing gaze of someone who'd interviewed hundreds of people and learned to spot liars. What changed? Why now, after 8 years of silence? Edward looked through the glass at Elena, barely visible in the dim light of her room. I looked at my daughter dying and realized I'd spent her entire life choosing silence over her, choosing comfort over courage. My wife once told me I just needed permission to be a coward, and she was my excuse. She was right, But Elena didn't give me permission to let her mother die unanswered for. She didn't give me permission to abandon her twice. Nobody gave me that permission. I just took it because I could. Because men like me always can. He turned back to Daniel. So write the story. Make sure people understand that Teresa Hartwell died fighting for her daughter. That she was brave and I was not. That wealth and power and connections can bury truth, but only if people let them. Daniel pulled out his notebook, his pen already moving. I'm going to need you to go on record. Full interview, everything you know, everything you suspected. Video if you're willing. I'll do it, Edward said. After the procedure, after I know Elena's going to survive. And if she doesn't? Daniel asked, then immediately looked apologetic. I'm sorry, that was... No, it's fair. Edward's voice was hollow. If she doesn't survive, then I spend the rest of my life knowing I finally did one right thing, even if it wasn't enough. But I still tell the story. I still make sure her mother's death means something. At 5:30 a.m., Dr. Chen found Edward and explained the procedure one final time. He'd be under general anesthesia. They'd extract marrow from his pelvic bone with a large needle, multiple punctures to collect enough stem cells. Recovery would be painful, a week or two of significant discomfort. But the marrow would be processed and infused into Elena within hours, giving her immune system the best possible chance of rebuilding itself. She'll still need to stay in isolation for several weeks, Dr. Chen explained. The transplant can trigger rejection, infection, complications. But Mr. Calloway, if this works, and I think it will work, you'll have given your daughter her life back. It's the least I owe her, Edward said. The very least. They wheeled him into pre-op at 5:50 a.m. A nurse inserted an IV, asked standard questions about allergies and previous surgeries. Edward answered mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He thought about Teresa, wondered if she'd known when she recorded that conversation with Margaret that she was documenting her own death warrant. Wondered if she'd been scared when her brakes failed, if she'd thought of Elena in those final seconds, if she'd died believing her daughter would grow up never knowing her father had existed. The anesthesiologist introduced himself, explained the process. Edward nodded, understanding none of it. As they began to administer the sedation, he felt himself slipping away, and his last conscious thought was a prayer to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Let this be enough. Let this one thing be enough. He woke 3 hours later in recovery, his pelvis throbbing with a deep, bone-aching pain that felt appropriate somehow. Fitting. Dr. Chen stood beside his bed, smiling. The extraction went perfectly, she said. We got excellent marrow samples. Elena's already receiving the infusion. Now we wait and see if her body accepts it. Can I see her? Not yet. She's in isolation, but I can show you the viewing window. Dr. Chen helped him into a wheelchair. His legs were shaky from anesthesia and pain, and rolled him to a different area of the ICU. Through reinforced glass, Edward could see Elena in a sterile room, connected to even more machines than before. The marrow infusion dripped into her central line, a burgundy liquid that looked disturbingly like wine. She was unconscious, sedated through the procedure. The next 72 hours are critical, Dr. Chen explained. We're watching for signs of engraftment, her body accepting the new marrow and beginning to produce healthy cells. We're also watching for rejection, infection, graft versus host disease. She's not out of the woods yet, Edward. Not by a long shot. But she has a chance now, Edward said. A real chance. Yes, Dr. Chen confirmed. Thanks to you. Edward shook his head. Thanks to her mother's genetics. I'm just the coward who finally did what should have been done 8 years ago. Patricia Reynolds appeared, her expression grim. Mr. Calloway, there's a situation downstairs. Your wife is holding that press conference, and she's... Well, you should probably see this. Someone had set up a laptop at the nurse's station, streaming the local news. There was Margaret, poised and perfect in designer clothing, standing in front of a bank of microphones with Gerard beside her. The Chiron read, Calloway family addresses, hospitalized daughter scandal. Deeply painful situation, Margaret was saying, her voice breaking in exactly the right places. Edward and I have been privately supporting Elena since we adopted her 8 years ago. We tried to give her a normal life away from media scrutiny, which is why we chose private placement rather than raising her in our home. We felt it was in her best interest, given the challenges she'd already faced in the foster system. What about the genetic test showing Edward is her biological father? A reporter shouted. Margaret's expression shifted to sympathy, so perfect it looked rehearsed. That's a private family matter we're still processing. Edward recently learned about his biological connection to Elena through these medical tests. It's been emotional for all of us, but regardless of genetics, we have always considered Elena family, and Edward is currently donating bone marrow to save her life. That's what matters, not the circumstances of her birth, but the love we have for her now. Edward felt Patricia's hand on his shoulder, steadying. "She's spinning it," Patricia said unnecessarily, "making you both look like heroes." "Keep watching," Edward said grimly. Another reporter. "Mrs. Calloway, there are rumors that Elena's biological mother worked for your family and died under suspicious circumstances. Can you comment?" Margaret's face showed precisely calculated shock. "I'm not sure where these rumors are coming from, but they're deeply hurtful. Teresa Hartwell was a valued employee who died in a tragic accident. We were devastated by her loss, which is part of why we felt so committed to caring for Elena. Suggesting anything sinister about a car accident that was thoroughly investigated is not only false but disrespectful to Teresa's memory." "But," the reporter pressed. Gerard stepped forward smoothly. "Mrs. Calloway has answered your question. Now, if you'll excuse us, the family is focused on Elena's recovery. We'll have more information as her condition stabilizes." "Thank you." Margaret walked away from the podium with perfect posture, leaving chaos in her wake. Within minutes, the narrative was spreading. Wealthy couple privately supporting adopted daughter, biological connection recently discovered, heroic bone marrow donation, complicated but ultimately loving family situation. Edward watched his wife steal his redemption in real time, repackage his confession into public relations gold, and turn a story about murder and abandonment into a heartwarming tale of discovered family bonds. "No," he said quietly. Then, louder, "No." He grabbed Patricia's phone, ignoring the pain screaming from his pelvis. Dialed Daniel Pierce. "How fast can you publish?" "Edward, I told you I need a week to verify." "You have the recording. You have Teresa's neighbor as a witness. You have Darlene's documents. You have my statement on video. How fast?" A pause. Then, "If I cut corners, skip some verification steps, 24 hours. But Edward, if I rush this and get something wrong, it could blow the whole investigation. Lawyers will tear it apart." "Then don't get anything wrong," Edward said. "But get it out. Because right now my wife is on television rewriting history, and if I wait another week, her version becomes the truth." "You're sure about this?" "Because once it's published, there's no taking it back." Edward looked through the glass at Elena, at his daughter receiving his marrow, fighting to survive. "Publish it," he said. "Tonight. Everything. The recording, the timeline, my statement about what I knew and when. Show them who Teresa really was. Show them what Margaret did. And show them exactly the kind of man I've been, so they understand the difference between redemption and public relations." He hung up and handed Patricia back her phone. She was staring at him with something that might have been respect. "That was brave," she said. "No," Edward corrected. "That was just finally doing what should have been done 8 years ago." Brave was Teresa, fighting for her daughter knowing it might cost her everything. Brave is Elena, still breathing after everything we put her through. I'm not brave. I'm just finally tired of being a coward. By midnight, Daniel Pierce's article went live on the Indianapolis Star's website. Millionaire's secret, suspicious death, abandoned daughter, and 8 years of silence. The recording was embedded, verified by 3 independent audio forensic experts. Darlene Washington was quoted extensively. Linda Chen provided testimony, and Edward's video statement played at the end. 5 minutes of unflinching confession about everything he'd suspected, everything he'd ignored, everything he'd allowed. Within an hour, it had been picked up by AP, Reuters, CNN. By 2 a.m., it was trending nationally. By dawn, federal investigators were contacting the Indiana State Police about reopening Teresa Hartwell's death investigation. By noon, Margaret Calloway's attorney issued a statement denying all allegations. By afternoon, she'd been indicted on conspiracy charges. And through it all, Elena slept in her isolation room, unaware that her father had finally chosen truth over comfort, her mother's memory over his own preservation, and her life over everything else he'd spent 8 years building. The engraftment would take days to confirm. The legal battles would take years. But for the first time in 8 years, Edward Calloway felt like he might, eventually, be able to look at himself in a mirror without hatred. It was a start. 2 months later, Elena walked out of St. Andrew's Children's Hospital on a crisp December morning, wrapped in a donated winter coat 3 sizes too big and carrying a stuffed elephant that one of the nurses had given her. The transplant had taken. Her body had accepted Edward's marrow, and slowly, painfully, cell by cell, she was rebuilding herself. Her hair was beginning to grow back in soft patches. Her skin had lost that grayish pallor, and though she tired easily and would need monitoring for years, Dr. Chen had used the word that mattered most: remission. Edward wasn't there for her discharge. He'd been explicitly asked not to be. Instead, waiting by the hospital entrance was Rebecca Torres, a former pediatric nurse who'd followed Elena's story in the news and petitioned for emergency foster placement. She was 47, single, with kind eyes and hands that had held hundreds of sick children but never had one of her own. She'd lost her nursing license years ago after reporting a doctor for negligence. Turned out the doctor had powerful friends, and Rebecca had none. She'd spent the last decade working retail and volunteering at shelters, waiting for a chance to do what she'd always been meant to do: love a child who needed loving. "Ready?" Rebecca asked softly, holding out her hand. Elena took it, and they walked through the automatic doors together. No press, no cameras. Darlene Washington had made sure of that, threatening legal action against any media outlet that tried to photograph Elena without permission. The girl deserved privacy to heal, Darlene had said, and for once, people had listened. But Edward watched from a distance, not at the hospital, but from across the street, sitting in his car with the heat running and his hands gripping the steering wheel. He'd promised Elena he wouldn't intrude, wouldn't force his presence on her recovery, but he'd needed to see her leave, needed to witness this small miracle of her survival. She looked so small in that oversized coat, holding Rebecca's hand, looking nothing like the hollow-eyed girl he'd seen dying in the ICU 2 months ago. She didn't look toward his car, didn't know he was there, and that was how it should be. Edward's phone buzzed. His attorney, Marcus Bennett, the one honest lawyer he'd kept after firing the fixers. "The DA wants to meet. They're offering a deal." "What kind of deal?" "Immunity for your testimony against Margaret. No charges for obstruction or conspiracy. You walk away clean." Edward closed his eyes. Clean. As if there was any world where he walked away from this clean. What does Margaret get? 20 years minimum if convicted. Her lawyers are fighting hard, but that recording is damning. Combined with your testimony and the reopened investigation into Teresa's death, the evidence is overwhelming. Federal prosecutors are involved now, crossing state lines to obstruct justice, witness tampering. She's looking at serious time. "Tell the DA I'll testify," Edward said. "But I don't want immunity. I want whatever consequences I've earned for staying silent, for not protecting Teresa when I could have, for not protecting Elena. I'll take a plea deal if they offer one, but I won't walk away like I did nothing wrong." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Edward, that's not how this works. You take the immunity. You rebuild your life. You've already lost everything. Your marriage, your reputation, most of your business contracts. Don't throw away your freedom too." "My freedom was never mine to keep," Edward said. "Not while I was buying it with silence about Teresa's murder. Just set up the meeting. I'll tell them everything I know and they can decide what I deserve." He hung up and watched Elena climb into Rebecca's modest Honda Civic, saw the woman buckle her in carefully, saw them drive away toward a life that didn't include him. It hurt more than the bone marrow extraction, more than the public humiliation, more than the business empire crumbling. But it was the right kind of hurt, the kind that meant consequences were finally real. 3 weeks later, Edward stood in a federal courtroom and testified for 6 hours about everything he'd known, suspected, and failed to act on regarding Teresa Hartwell's death. Margaret sat at the defense table, perfectly composed in Chanel, her expression never wavering even as Edward described finding the revoked will, hearing the recording, piecing together the timeline of threats and convenient accidents. The prosecutor asked, "Mr. Calloway, why didn't you come forward with these suspicions 8 years ago?" Edward looked directly at the jury, 12 ordinary people who would decide his wife's fate. "Because I was a coward. Because I benefited from the silence. Because admitting what I suspected would have destroyed my political ambitions and my marriage and my comfortable life. I chose comfort over truth, and a good woman is dead because of it. And a child spent 8 years without either of her parents because I was too weak to do what was right." Margaret's attorney objected, claiming prejudicial testimony. The judge sustained it, but the words hung in the air anyway, and Edward saw several jurors looking at Margaret with expressions that suggested no amount of expensive lawyers could undo what they'd heard. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Margaret was convicted on 5 counts including conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. She received 24 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 16. When the verdict was read, she finally broke, just for a moment, her perfect composure cracking to reveal genuine terror before the mask slammed back into place. Edward, as promised, refused immunity. He pled guilty to obstruction of justice and received 3 years to be served at a minimum security facility. His lawyers argued for probation given his cooperation, but Edward had asked the judge for prison time. "I need to understand what consequences feel like," he'd said during sentencing. "I've spent my entire life avoiding them." The judge had looked at him with something that might have been respect and granted his request. 6 months into his sentence, Edward received a letter. The handwriting was young, careful, with the slightly uneven letters of someone still recovering from months of medical trauma. No return address, just Elena, signed at the bottom. "Mr. Calloway, Rebecca says I should call you Edward, or Dad if I want to, but I'm not ready for either of those yet. Mr. Calloway feels right for now. Formal, like we're still figuring out what we are to each other. Dr. Chen says I'm doing well. My blood counts are normal. My hair is growing back, curly like my mama's was, which makes me happy. Rebecca is teaching me to cook. I'm in 7th grade now, catching up on everything I missed. I'm behind in math but ahead in reading because I read a lot in the hospital. Darlene visits every Sunday. She brings me photos of my mama and tells me stories. I'm learning who she was, really was, not the version people tell to make themselves feel better. She was brave, braver than anyone knew. And she loved me so much she died fighting for me. That's hard to carry sometimes, Mr. Calloway, knowing someone loved you that much and lost everything because of it. Rebecca says you're in prison. She showed me the articles about the trial, about how you refused immunity and asked to be sentenced. I don't know what to do with that information. Part of me thinks it's the least you deserved. Part of me thinks it's more than most men like you would ever do. Maybe it's both. I don't forgive you. I need you to know that. I don't forgive you for letting my mama die, or for abandoning me twice, or for all the years you chose to look away. But I also don't hate you anymore. Hate takes energy, and I'm tired of being tired. So I'm trying something else instead. I'm trying to let you be a person who did terrible things and also finally did one right thing. That's complicated and messy, and I don't have to decide what it means yet. Maybe someday I'll want to see you. Maybe I'll want to hear your voice tell me about my mama, the parts you knew, the parts you should have known. Or maybe I won't. Maybe this letter is all I'll ever need to say to you. I don't know yet, and that's okay. I'm 12. I have time to figure it out. Rebecca says you set up a trust fund for my education and medical care. I want you to know I'm using it, not because I forgive you, but because my mama would have wanted me to have every opportunity to build a good life. And if your money helps me do that, then okay. That's one right thing among many wrong ones. There's a quote Rebecca showed me. It said, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." You should have been my father 20 years ago. You should have protected my mama. You should have done so many things you didn't do. But you donated the marrow now. You told the truth now. You're accepting consequences now. It's not enough to erase the past. But maybe it's enough to be a different person going forward. I hope prison isn't too hard. That's a weird thing to say to someone who helped cover up your mother's murder. But it's true. I don't want you to suffer more than what helps you become better. Suffering without learning is just cruelty. And I've seen enough cruelty. Take care of yourself, Mr. Calloway. And maybe, when you get out, if I'm ready, we can meet somewhere neutral. Not as father and daughter, not yet. Maybe not ever. But as two people who share DNA and a history and a woman, we both failed in different ways. We can talk about my mama, about who she really was, about what her life meant beyond how it ended. Or maybe we won't. Maybe this letter is goodbye. I don't know yet. Either way, I'm going to be okay. Rebecca makes sure of that. Darlene makes sure of that. Dr. Chen makes sure of that. And my mama, even though she's gone, she makes sure of that too. Because she taught me by example that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right anyway. So thank you for the marrow. Thank you for telling the truth. And thank you for staying away while I heal. Maybe someday those will be enough. Elena Edward read the letter 17 times that first day, sitting on his narrow prison bunk while his cellmate pretended not to notice the tears streaming down his face. He kept it in his pocket, close to his heart, a reminder of grace he hadn't earned but had been given anyway. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the possibility, distant and uncertain, that maybe someday the daughter he'd failed might see him as human, flawed and failing, but trying. Finally, after all these years, trying. That night, Edward signed up for the prison's volunteer program. They needed help in the Children's Visitation Center, men to play with kids whose fathers were incarcerated, to read stories, to push them on swings during supervised visits, men to show children that fathers could be present, even when they'd failed in the past. Edward would never get those years back with Elena, would never undo the damage, never erase Teresa's death, never deserve the redemption he'd tried to purchase with bone marrow and confession. But he could spend the rest of his life being the kind of man Elena might not hate, the kind of man Teresa had deserved, the kind of man who finally understood that silence was the cruelest weapon of all. And maybe, in 17 months when his sentence ended, Elena would be ready to meet. Or maybe she wouldn't. Either way, Edward would respect her choice, would give her the space and agency he'd never given Teresa, would let her write the ending to this story, because it was her story more than his. Her survival, her strength, her choice whether or not a father who'd failed her twice deserved a third chance. That was how love worked when you'd forfeited the right to claim it. You offered it anyway, without demanding anything in return. You planted trees in scorched earth and hoped someday they might grow. You lived with consequences and called it justice. You accepted that some debts could never be fully paid, but you paid them anyway because the alternative was remaining the man you'd been. And slowly, one day at a time, one child's laughter in a prison visitation room, one letter kept close to a heart learning to break open instead of closed, Edward Calloway began the long journey from coward to something resembling human. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. Some debts can never be fully paid, but we pay them anyway, because the alternative is remaining who we were in our worst moments. Edward Calloway spent 8 years choosing silence over his daughter, comfort over courage, reputation over truth. And in the end, it took a dying child to teach a grown man what bravery actually looks like. Not the absence of fear, but doing what's right despite the cost. Teresa Hartwell died fighting for her daughter to know her father. Elena survived fighting to simply exist in a world that had abandoned her twice. And Edward? He finally stopped running from consequences and started walking toward them, knowing he might never be forgiven but trying anyway. This story asks us an uncomfortable question. How many times do we choose silence because the truth is inconvenient? How many Teresas have we failed to protect because speaking up would cost us something we weren't willing to lose? If you were Edward, would you have had the courage to tell the truth when it meant losing everything? If you were Elena, could you find it in your heart to grant even the smallest mercy to a father who failed you in every way that mattered? These aren't easy questions. They're not supposed to be, because real life doesn't offer clean redemption or Hollywood endings. It offers choices and consequences, and the slow, painful work of becoming better than we were yesterday. Elena's letter said it perfectly. The best time to do the right thing was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So what truth have you been avoiding? What silence have you been maintaining because breaking it would be too costly? What child, literal or metaphorical, have you abandoned because facing them would mean facing yourself? If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or question something you've been avoiding, then it did what stories are meant to do. Please hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge us to be better than our worst moments. Leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Edward's place. We read every single one, and your perspective matters. Because ultimately, we're all just people trying to figure out when courage matters more than comfort. And sometimes it takes a story like Elena's to remind us that the answer is always right now. The time to be brave is always right now.